Okay, so this slideshow is going to focus on the second half of Chapter 15. So we've already talked a lot about fresh water, what different types are, what are some of the problems, but here we're going to focus specifically on pollution. All right, so we're going to start with the major categories, and some of these we've addressed in other places. So nutrient pollution is one of those we talked about right in the beginning of the year when we talked about eutrophication. So increasing nutrient levels, particularly nitrogen and phosphorus. And remember, when we're talking about fresh water, we're a little bit more concerned with the phosphorus content, whereas salt water, we're more concerned with the nitrogen content. But regardless, both of those nutrients are going to increase the nutrients in the water, which is going to increase the algae, right? Eventually, the algae die off, increase in bacteria, decrease in oxygen levels. All right. If we look here, here's our oligotrophic water body. So this is low in nutrients, nice and clear. Here's our eutrophic water body. So this is higher in nutrients, obviously not so clear. So in addition to oxygen levels, we also have to think about how much light can penetrate. So what kind of things are going to be able to grow underneath this layer? All right, don't forget that when we're talking about human impact, so we're talking about fertilizer runoff, then we're talking about cultural eutrophication. Some bodies of water are going to naturally be higher in nutrients, but we're more concerned with the ones that are higher in nutrients because of something we are doing. Okay, when we think about nutrient pollution, right, some of the solutions would be treat the wastewater. So try to get rid of the phosphorus and nitrogen before we release it back into the rivers. Decrease fertilizer use. We've already talked about that a fair amount. Increase vegetation. So vegetation will pull that nitrogen and phosphorus out before it reaches the water. This is where you probably also see in supermarkets that detergents are phosphate free. So that's actually been a regulation that's been implemented to help decrease the amount of phosphates that eventually make it to our water. All right, the second category, pathogens and waterborne diseases. So these are things that primarily are going to occur due to inadequately treated sewage or animal waste runoff. So this is primarily from those large feedlots we were talking about. They're just so concentrated and have so much waste that tends to become a problem. Okay, so if we're thinking of pathogens and waterborne diseases, these can be caused by viruses, protists, bacteria. Right? Examples could be things like typhoid or hepatitis A. Again, they come from human waste, from sewage, animal waste, from feedlots. And this is a major problem in many parts of the world, especially where sewage treatment is not as common. So 1 billion people actually are without safe water supplies and safe drinking supplies. And the solutions here is we either treat the wastewater or you can disinfect the drinking water or some combination thereof. And you can also increase hygiene measures so people aren't collecting water downstream from where sewage is being released or washing their dishes in dirty water, that kind of thing. Okay. The third topic are toxic chemicals. So these are things like pesticides, petroleum products. We've talked a little bit in the first unit about toxic metals, so arsenic, lead, mercury. These are things that have neurological effects. When we talked about mining, we talked about acid runoff. There can also be things like cyanide runoff from the various processing things. So all of those are toxic chemicals. And solutions could be legislating and enforcing more stringent regulations. So, how mining companies dispose of water or where they keep their waste ponds, those kinds of things. Modify the industrial processes to create less pollution in the first place. And then we can modify our purchasing choices to try to purchase things that have less impact on the environment. All right, here's the fourth category, so sediment. So again, we've talked a lot about this already. So mining, clear cutting, land clearing for development, poor farming techniques, all of those things increase erosion And that eroded soil is then going to wind up in streams and rivers, and it can harm aquatic life and habitats. So think about if you're, an invertebrate that lives on the bottom, all of a sudden you're covered in sediment. It impacts what that environment looks like, especially if it's an environment that has evolved without those large sediment loads. Okay, solution, we've talked about some of these, better management of farms, so all those soil conservation practices we talked about. Anytime you can avoid large-scale disturbance of vegetation, because all those roots hold the soil in place. And you can also plant vegetation as a buffer zone. So remember those riparian buffer zones we talked about? That can help filter out some of that erosion before it hits the water. Okay. And finally, thermal pollution. We mentioned this briefly in class the other day. So we can think of this as a lot of times as increase in temperature, right? So if it's water that's pulled into a plant to cool off equipment, or in some way cool down like a nuclear power plant, and then it's released at a higher temperature, that obviously can have an effect. It also decreases the dissolved oxygen, if you remember from chemistry. As the temperature of the water increases, dissolved oxygen levels decrease, right? But it could also be colder water. So we talked about dams. If they're releasing water from reservoirs, they may actually be releasing water that's colder than normal because it's coming from the deep. So that can impact vegetation and aquatic life in the area. Okay, so those are the types of pollution. We can really also talk about two main overall categories, and this holds true for water pollution and when we talk about air pollution, and that is non-point sources of water versus point sources of water. So if we look at these point sources of water, right, sewage treatment plants, factories or disposal sites, see there's a pipe that's coming from this. So these are things we can trace back to the exact point, okay? Whereas non-point sources are much more diffuse. They're things that, may filter over a large area. It may go through, like here, they're showing a residential neighborhood, but what if there's a residential neighborhood and then a construction site and then a golf course, and we know the water here is polluted? How do we figure out which of these things it came from? So this is much more difficult to deal with because nobody wants to take responsibility for it. This is a little bit easier to regulate because at least we have a pipe, we can do tests, we can trace it back to exactly where it came from, and then we can regulate that. Okay, just a few things to point out. Here's your acid drainage from mines we've talked about. We talked a little bit about oil spills, right? Eroded soil from construction sites. So these, notice, we're hitting all of those categories we just talked about. Nutrients and fertilizer, bacteria and waste products, right? Chemicals from urban runoff, industrial waste and toxic chemicals, right? Eroded soil. So you should be able to put those into each of their categories. All right, so we've talked a little bit about types of pollution. How do we monitor it? So we need some methods to look at the water quality. And they basically go into three categories: biological, chemical, and physical. Biological, you learned a little bit about with your math bench. So you were counting fecal coliform bacteria. So remember, this was an indicator of what other types of bacteria might be present that would be bad for human health. It could be algae, right? So nutrient levels, how much algae is there in the water? And it can also be, especially for streams, people look at what insects are there. Some insects are more sensitive to pollution than others. So looking at what types are there could tell you something about the water quality. All right, we can also do tests. Just like you did soil tests, you do water tests. So you test for phosphorus and nitrogen, pH. Hardness is something, so that's the dissolved amount of calcium and magnesium. All right, so if you have water from a well, sometimes you'll hear people say they have soft water. So they actually treat it a little bit so that it has more of the taste and sort of properties we expect from water. And then physical properties, turbidity, right? How cloudy does it look? What's the color? What's the temperature? So we'll actually do a lab where we look at this in a little bit more detail. All right. We've been talking mostly about surface water, but all of those pollution types that we're talking about can leach into the groundwater. So those are the aquifers, well water, right? This is more difficult to monitor and manage. How do we figure out where it came from, right? How do we get rid of it? So this is going to break down more slowly. It's not going to get flushed out, okay? It can be, human-made. It can be things that we're doing. It can also be there's some natural contamination. So there's a pretty famous case study in Bangladesh where they were trying to help people by constructing wells in various villages and communities. What they didn't know was that there were actually naturally high levels of arsenic in some of these areas. So some of the people were actually being poisoned with arsenic, and they had to shut the wells down. And that was just natural contamination from where they were. Okay, but we focus a lot on human activity. So any of those pollutants, again, can leach through the soil and eventually reach groundwater. It can be because of improperly designed wells. Sometimes people will actually pump hazardous waste below ground, hoping to sort of keep it contained, but then it winds up drifting to places we don't expect. It can be leakage from septic tanks, industrial tanks, oil and gas tanks. So every once in a while, you'll see a story of people that live near gas stations, for instance. All of a sudden, their well water will be contaminated with various petroleum chemicals because some of those underground tanks have become corroded and maybe are releasing chemicals. So here is an example of some tanks that are becoming corroded and maybe leaking into the groundwater. Okay, agriculture, all those fertilizers, if they don't run off, they may actually leach through the soil, and eventually if they reach groundwater, they could contaminate it. Same thing with pathogens from various animal sewage, for instance, and manufacturing and military sites. So again, every once in a while you'll hear about, Aberdeen, for instance, sometimes has issues with this from military sites. All right, so what can we do? So there are some legislative and regulatory efforts to reduce pollution, right? The main one is this Clean Water Act that was enacted in 1977. Unfortunately, in recent years, this has actually been not as well implemented, and some of the regulations have been lessened. So in fact, the EPA is not testing as much, and then when they do find people that aren't in compliance, they're not fining as much. So it turns out there have been instances where our drinking water has been contaminated and people don't know about it. One of the success stories has actually been the Great Lakes. So here is a map of the Great Lakes. So you can see this is a huge watershed, and they had severe problems with agricultural runoff, pollution, and especially with algae blooms that were really killing a lot of the wildlife and fish in the area. Especially Lake Erie was particularly affected. The lakes have also been affected by a whole variety of other things. So we've built shipping channels that connect all the lakes, but this also means that invasive species can basically travel from one to the other pretty easily. It means pollution can travel. So the Great Lakes have been greatly affected. And there have been a variety of efforts, both on the Canadian and the American side, to reduce, for instance, agricultural runoff. And there have been pretty steep reductions in some of these pollutants. They haven't gotten rid of them entirely. They still have some trouble with with those algae blooms. But it's seen as a success story that they've really improved in quality in recent years. One of the problems when you try to clean up these incidents is point versus non-point. So remember we said point source, you can figure out where it came from. Non-point source is much more difficult to regulate because it's difficult to prove. And overall, eutrophication and acid precipitation are still really major challenges. All right, so what do we do for drinking water? So drinking water is treated, and the standards are set by the EPA. And basically, it's treated to remove particulate matter. So we want it clear with nothing in it. It's passed through various filters. It's disinfected with chlorine. So mostly in the US, our water is chlorinated, especially in some parts of Europe. They use ozone or UV light to disinfect it. Safe water. And if we look back, if you go through the actual slideshow and click on these, you can see these are actual water reports. So you can see what they test for and what their process is. And this one down here has a little bit of the history of Baltimore water, which is kind of interesting. Okay, so that's drinking water. So what about wastewater? So this is after you've drank it, what happens later. So if you live in a rural area or a little bit further from the city, you may have a septic system. So a septic system is basically taking waste from the house, and there's like basically a big pit that they dig, and the sludge settles to the bottom, and the water is then sort of filtered through the ground and is treated with bacteria to help break down any organic contamination. And then it basically just filters out and it sort of leaves the sludge behind. Every once in a while, you have to have this removed to free up the septic system. Okay. But most of us that live near Baltimore are going to be on Baltimore sewer system. So this is a municipal sewer system. And this basically treats wastewater. Now, you can actually think there's a lot of waste here because all the water from your house basically goes into the municipal sewer systems. So this could be, every time you turn on the sink, when you take a shower, and when you use the toilet. So those actually have different levels of contamination and need different levels of treatment, but we treat it all the same. Some areas are starting to use gray water more. So this is kind of in between water. So it's not potable, it's not drinkable, but it's probably perfectly fine for irrigation, to water golf courses. So some areas, especially in California, where water is more of an issue, are starting to think about how to use gray water more effectively. Okay, but our wastewater basically goes to wastewater treatment facilities. The major one in the area is our Back River treatment facility. And each treatment facility is slightly different, but these are the main components. Is primary treatment is you remove physical removal of contaminants. So we let things settle out, and then we move further things with clarifiers. It's treated then with bacteria that help degrade organic pollutants. It's disinfected, so with chlorine, sometimes UV light. And then the effluent, so again, this is just the out. So what goes out from the treatment plant is then piped into rivers or the ocean. All right. Some of this might be reclaimed water for lawns and golf courses. And then the sludge that's left over, right, this could go to a landfill, it could be incinerated, or it can be used as fertilizer. So this is the picture from your book of the overall sequence and basically what happens kind of to each stage along the pathway. Okay, and another thing that people are really doing with wastewater is also, instead of just releasing it straight from treatment into the river or ocean, is to actually construct wetlands and have the wetlands actually do that final filtration, right? We've talked a lot about how plants can take up excess nutrients. These are things that wastewater treatment plants have a hard time getting out of the system. We talked about phytoremediation. Remember that from the beginning unit. So some plants can take up various contaminants. So a lot of water systems, as they upgrade, are thinking about how to incorporate wetlands. So here's just a picture of what that might look like, various plants that are particularly good at, okay? And so what are some problems? So hopefully we'll see a few clips next week when we talk about this. But some of the problems are, some of the things we put down the drain, our wastewater system treatment is not designed to handle, okay? So think about pharmaceutical waste, right? When we take medicine, it's metabolized and then it's excreted. So that all goes into the sewage system. So things like birth control pills, right? Those are reproductive hormones that are then released into water systems. And the wastewater treatment plants really aren't set up to deal with that. Second, nowadays, the big issue is with microplastics. So these are really small pieces of plastic that are not going to be filtered out. And people are really starting to be worried about what outcomes this could have because they're finding these all over the place. Basically, almost all water supplies at this point have them. So what are they going to do? And then the other problem is what happens when the sewage overflows. So again, remember back Unit 1 when we talked about Tijuana and the wastewater systems there? When it rained a lot, they got too much input and the system can't handle it, so then some of it goes untreated. Well, Baltimore has the same problem. We have an aging sewer system, right? The lines have various porousness to them. They're old, they're cracked. So when it rains a lot, water seeps into the sewage from outside sources. So that increases the volume, and then it backs up because the sewage system can't handle it. And that's when you wind up hearing about streams that there's been a sewage overflow because there's outlets that wind up then sort of backflowing into, and that's when you get a stream, or the Jones Falls, they'll say has a sewage overflows. All right. Currently, Baltimore's actually working on improvements to the backwater treatment center so that they can handle more of this and so that they don't wind up having that backup. All right, so